The rain hit the cathedral steps like bullets against stone, each drop echoing the rhythm of my heartbeat as I stood in full dress uniform outside St. Michael's Church. Through the tall arched windows I could see them, my entire family gathered in the warm golden light, their black clothing a stark contrast to the vibrant stained glass behind them. My mother sat in the front pew, her silver hair perfectly styled despite her tears. My two brothers flanked her sides like sentries, their wives whispering comfort into her ears. Even my cousins had come from 3 states away. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. But there was no space for me. My name is Commander Sarah Elizabeth Hawthorne, though my family stopped using it years ago. To the United States Navy, I'm Admiral Hawthorne, the youngest woman ever to achieve 4-star rank at age 47. I've commanded fleets across 3 oceans, made decisions that saved thousands of lives, and earned respect from every corner of the Pentagon. But to the people sitting warm and dry inside that church, mourning the man who raised me, I was nothing more than an embarrassment they preferred to forget. The funeral director had delivered their message that morning with apologetic eyes and a voice barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, I'm terribly sorry, but the family has requested that you not attend the service. They've asked that you respect their wishes during this difficult time." His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, probably wondering how someone could ban their own daughter from her father's funeral. I'd simply nodded, straightened my uniform jacket, and walked away. What else could I do? Cause a scene? Force my way into a church where I wasn't wanted? After 30 years of military discipline, I knew how to follow orders, even the ones that shattered something deep inside my chest. So here I stood, water dripping from the brim of my service cap, watching through glass as strangers offered condolences to my mother, while she dabbed her eyes with tissues. I watched my older brother Marcus stand to speak about Dad's legacy, his voice carrying through the slightly open doors. He talked about Dad's love for family, his dedication to his children, his pride in watching us grow into the people we became. Haba. The irony cut deeper than any blade. Haba. Marcus spoke as if I had never existed. As if Dad hadn't spent countless hours teaching me to tie nautical knots in our garage. As if he hadn't been the one to drive me to the Naval Academy when I was 18 and scared out of my mind. As if those letters he sent during my first deployment, the ones I still kept in a wooden box beside my bed, had never been written. Through the rain-streaked window, I could see Dad's casket draped with an American flag. He'd served briefly in the Army during Vietnam, though he rarely talked about it. What he did talk about was how proud he was when I graduated from Annapolis, how he'd saved every newspaper clipping of my promotions, how he used to tell his poker buddies that his daughter commanded ships bigger than city blocks. Or at least, that's what I thought he felt. My youngest brother Dylan had set me straight about that 3 years ago, during what would become our final conversation. "Dad doesn't brag about you, Sarah," he'd said with a coldness that still made my stomach clench. "He's embarrassed. We all are. You think wearing stars on your shoulders makes you better than us, but all you've really done is turn yourself into something he doesn't recognize anymore." The words had hit me like a physical blow, mainly because part of me wondered if they were true. Had my dedication to service, my climb through the ranks, my willingness to make the hard decisions that leadership demanded, had all of that somehow made me unrecognizable to the man who used to read me bedtime stories about brave sailors navigating stormy seas? I shifted my weight from one polished shoe to the other, feeling the rain seep through my jacket at the collar. The metal ribbons on my chest, 37 of them, each representing a mission, a deployment, a moment when my country had asked something of me and I had delivered, felt heavier than usual. Among them was the Navy Distinguished Service Medal, earned during a rescue operation in the South China Sea that had made international headlines. There was the Defense Superior Service Medal from my time coordinating humanitarian aid after Hurricane Maria. And there, closest to my heart, was the simple Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal I'd received for my first command 23 years ago. Dad had been there for that ceremony. He'd stood in the audience wearing his best suit, the navy blue one he only brought out for special occasions. And when they pinned that ribbon to my uniform, I'd caught his eye across the room. The pride on his face had been unmistakable, genuine, warm. He'd mouthed the words, That's my girl. And for a moment, despite all the pomp and ceremony around us, it had felt like it was just the two of us in that room. But that was before everything changed. Before the promotions came faster than my family could understand. Before my picture started appearing in Navy publications and defense magazines. Before I became someone they saw on television, rather than someone who came home for Christmas dinner. The rain began to fall harder, forcing me to step closer to the church's stone archway for shelter. From this angle, I could see my mother more clearly. Eleanor Hawthorne had always been a formidable woman, 5 feet 2 inches of pure determination wrapped in cardigans and pearls. She'd raised 3 children while Dad worked double shifts at the shipyard, managed every family crisis with military precision, and somehow always knew exactly what to say when one of us came home with a broken heart or a bruised ego. But she'd stopped knowing what to say to me somewhere along the way. Our phone calls had grown shorter over the years, more formal, until they eventually stopped altogether. When I'd tried to visit last Christmas, she'd been polite but distant, asking about my work, as if commanding the Pacific Fleet was equivalent to filing paperwork in some anonymous office building. "You've gotten so serious, Sarah," she'd said during that visit, studying my face across her kitchen table. "You used to laugh more. You used to be softer." Softer. As if the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that thousands of sailors' lives depended on my decisions, the constant pressure of being one of only a handful of women at my level, as if all of that should have left me unchanged. As if I could command respect in war rooms, filled with hardened officers, by maintaining the same gentle demeanor I'd had as a teenager. I thought about the last time I'd seen Dad alive. It had been 6 months ago, during a brief shore leave when I'd driven the 4 hours from Norfolk to the small coastal town where I'd grown up. He'd been working in his garden, his hands dark with soil, silver hair catching the afternoon sunlight. When he looked up and saw me standing at his gate in civilian clothes, his face had gone through a series of expressions I couldn't quite read. Sarah. Not sweetheart or kiddo like he used to call me, just my name, spoken like he was confirming my identity rather than welcoming me home. We'd sat on his back porch for 2 hours, drinking sweet tea and talking about everything except what mattered. The weather. The neighbors. The state of his tomato plants. He'd asked polite questions about my position, as if being Admiral of the Pacific Fleet was just another job. But his eyes had seemed focused somewhere past my shoulder, like he was looking for the daughter he remembered instead of the woman sitting in front of him. When I'd finally worked up the courage to ask if he was proud of what I'd accomplished, he'd been quiet for a long moment. Then he'd patted my hand with his dirt-stained fingers and said, "I just hope you're happy, sweetheart. That's all I ever wanted for you." It wasn't an answer. It was an evasion, gentle but unmistakable. Now, as I watched his casket through the rain-streaked glass, I wondered if he'd ever really understood what happiness meant to me. The satisfaction of bringing every sailor under my command home safely from deployment. The pride of representing my country at international summits where my voice carried the weight of the world's strongest navy. The quiet moments on the bridge of a ship at dawn, watching the sun rise over waters that stretched beyond the horizon. These weren't the kinds of happiness you could explain over sweet tea on a back porch. They were earned in moments of crisis, forged in the crucible of command, tested in situations where failure meant more than personal disappointment. It meant lives lost, missions failed, trust broken. But how do you explain that to a father who wanted his little girl to come home for Sunday dinners and give him grandchildren to spoil? How do you bridge the gap between the person you were and the person you chose to become? The sound of voices rising in hymn drifted through the church doors, mixing with the rain and wind. Amazing Grace, Dad's favorite. He used to hum it while working in his garage, his voice deep and slightly off-key but filled with conviction. I found myself humming along softly, my breath visible in the cold air, and for a moment I could almost feel him beside me, his warm hand on my shoulder, telling me everything would be okay. But he wasn't beside me. He was in that flag-draped casket, and I was standing alone in the rain, banned from saying goodbye by the very people who should have understood that love and duty weren't mutually exclusive, that serving something greater than yourself didn't make you less of a daughter, sister, or human being. The irony was sharp enough to taste. I'd spent my entire adult life protecting the freedom that allowed my family to reject me. I'd sailed into harm's way to preserve the very democracy that gave them the right to shut me out of their grief. And somehow, in their minds, that made me the problem. As the hymn ended and I heard the shuffling of feet inside the church, I knew the service was nearly over. Soon they would carry Dad's casket to the cemetery 3 blocks away, where he would be laid to rest beside his parents and grandparents, continuing a family line that apparently no longer included me. I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket and scrolled through the messages that had been coming in all morning. Condolences from fellow officers who'd served with Dad decades ago. Respectful notes from Pentagon colleagues who understood loss. Warm words from sailors I'd commanded who remembered me mentioning my father during long deployments. But nothing from Marcus, Dylan, or Mom. Nothing from the cousins, aunts, or uncles inside that church. Nothing from the people who shared my blood and my history, but apparently not my values. The church doors opened, and people began to emerge, pulling coats tight against the rain. I stepped back deeper into the shadows of the archway, not wanting to force an uncomfortable encounter. But as my mother appeared in the doorway, supported by Marcus on one side and Dylan on the other, she looked directly at me. For a moment, our eyes met across the 30 feet of space and 10 years of silence between us. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying, but there was something else there too. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Recognition, certainly, but also something that might have been regret, or perhaps just exhaustion. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but Dylan whispered something in her ear and guided her toward the waiting funeral car. Marcus didn't even glance in my direction. And just like that, they were gone, leaving me alone with the rain and the weight of a goodbye I'd never get to say. The rejection hadn't started with the funeral. It had begun years earlier, so gradually that I'd barely noticed the shift until it was too late to stop it. Like watching the tide recede, you don't realize how far the water has pulled back until you're standing on dry sand, wondering when the ocean disappeared. I was 8 years old when I first announced I wanted to join the Navy. We were at the annual 4th of July barbecue in Millfield Harbor, our small town's biggest celebration. Dad had just finished grilling hamburgers for what seemed like half the neighborhood, and we were all sprawled on blankets watching the fireworks burst over the bay. When the Navy's Blue Angels flew overhead in perfect formation, their engines roaring like thunder, I jumped to my feet and declared to anyone who would listen that someday I was going to fly one of those planes. Marcus, who was 13 and thought he knew everything, laughed so hard he nearly choked on his soda. "Girls can't be pilots, dummy," he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "They're not strong enough." But Dad didn't laugh. He pulled me onto his lap and pointed up at the darkening sky where the jets had disappeared. "You know what, kiddo? If anyone could figure out how to fly one of those things, it would be you." His voice was warm and certain, and I believed him completely. Mom had been less enthusiastic. "Oh, Sarah, honey," she'd said with that particular tone mothers use when they think their children are being precious but impractical. "Wouldn't you rather be a teacher? Or maybe a nurse? Those are such important jobs for women." Even at 8, I'd felt the weight of that word, for women, like a boundary being drawn around my dreams. But Dad had squeezed my shoulders and whispered, "Don't let anyone tell you what you can't do, sweetheart. You're a hawthorn, and hawthorns don't quit." Those words became my compass for the next 40 years. The trouble was, being a hawthorn apparently meant different things to different people. For Marcus and Dylan, it meant staying close to home, finding steady jobs, marrying local girls, and raising children within a 20-mile radius of where we'd grown up. For me, it meant something else entirely. Something that would eventually take me so far from that small coastal town that I might as well have been living on another planet. The first crack in our family's foundation appeared when I was 16 and announced my intention to apply to the Naval Academy. We were sitting around the dinner table on a Tuesday night in October, the kind of ordinary evening that changes everything without warning. Mom had made her famous pot roast, and we were passing bowls of mashed potatoes and green beans while Dad told us about his day at the shipyard. "I got my SAT scores back," I said during a lull in conversation. 1480. "My guidance counselor says that's good enough for Annapolis if I can get a congressional nomination." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the kitchen clock ticking from the next room. Dylan, who was 14 and usually never stopped talking, actually put down his fork and stared at me. Marcus shook his head like I'd just announced my intention to join the circus. The Naval Academy? Mom's voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the alarm underneath. Sarah, that's very ambitious, honey. But don't you think you should have a backup plan? Something more traditional? What about State University? Marcus added helpfully. You could major in education, get your teaching certificate. That's a nice career for a girl. There it was again, for a girl. Those 3 words that seemed to shrink every dream I'd ever had to fit inside someone else's idea of appropriate. I looked at Dad, waiting for him to remind them about the Blue Angels, about his promise that I could do anything I set my mind to. But he was staring down at his plate, cutting his pot roast into smaller and smaller pieces, without actually eating any of it. Dad? I said softly. Remember what you told me about the Jets? About not quitting? He finally looked up, and for just a moment I saw the man who had encouraged my dreams. But then his gaze flickered to Mom, to my brothers, and something in his expression shifted. Well, he said carefully, maybe we should think about this practically. The military it's a hard life, sweetheart. Especially for women. I just want you to be happy. That phrase, I just want you to be happy, would become his standard response to every achievement, every promotion, every step I took away from the life they'd envisioned for me. It sounded supportive, but it felt like a gentle form of dismissal, as if my happiness was incompatible with my ambitions. I did get the congressional nomination. I did get accepted to Annapolis. And on the day I left for the academy, the entire family gathered on our front porch to see me off. Mom cried and made me promise to call every week. Marcus and Dylan gave me awkward hugs and told me to be careful. But it was Dad's goodbye that haunted me. He'd walked me to the car, carrying my single duffel bag with the careful reverence of a pallbearer. As I was about to get in, he'd grabbed my arm gently and said, "You know you can always come home, right? If this doesn't work out, if it's too hard, you can always come home and we'll figure out something else." At 18, I'd been too excited about my future to fully process what he was really saying. But looking back now, I understood. He wasn't encouraging me to succeed. He was giving me permission to fail, and worse, he was expecting me to fail. The phone calls home during my first year at the academy were exercises in careful translation. When I told them about the academic rigor, the physical challenges, the intense competition, they heard complaints rather than excitement. When I described the thrill of learning to navigate by the stars, the satisfaction of mastering complex engineering principles, the pride of earning my first leadership position, they heard a daughter growing distant rather than a woman growing strong. "You sound different," Mom said during one call in March of my freshman year. "Harder, more serious. Are you sure you're happy there?" I wanted to tell her that I was happier than I'd ever been, that I'd found my place in the world, that every challenge was making me stronger. But I could hear the worry in her voice, the hope that I might decide to come home and be the daughter she could understand. "I'm fine, Mom," I said instead. "Just busy with midterms." The gap widened during my second year when I made the dean's list and was selected for advanced navigation training. I called home bursting with pride, expecting them to share my excitement. Instead, I got polite congratulations that felt rehearsed, followed by detailed updates about Marcus's new job at the local bank, and Dylan's girlfriend who seems like such a sweet girl. By my third year, the conversations had taken on a formal quality, as if we were all reading from scripts. They would ask about my studies, as if I were pursuing a liberal arts degree rather than preparing to become a naval officer. I would provide sanitized updates that didn't mention the leadership challenges, the strategic thinking exercises, or the growing certainty that I was meant for something bigger than they could imagine. The transformation was complete by the time I graduated. When they came to Annapolis for commissioning, they looked like tourists visiting a foreign country. Mom wore her best dress and pearls, clutching her purse like a shield. Dad took pictures with the careful attention of someone documenting an event he didn't quite understand. Marcus and Dylan spent most of the ceremony checking their phones, clearly eager to get back to their familiar world. But the moment that crystallized everything was during the reception afterward. A fellow graduate's father, a retired Marine colonel, approached our group and began talking to Dad about my achievements, my class ranking, my leadership positions, my selection for destroyer duty. He spoke with the easy camaraderie of one military father to another, assuming Dad shared his pride in having raised a warrior. Dad's response was a masterclass in polite deflection. "Well, yes, we're very proud," he said in the tone people use when discussing a child's participation trophy. "We just hope she'll be safe and happy." The colonel looked confused for a moment, then nodded politely and moved on. But I saw the exact moment when Dad realized he'd failed some test he didn't even know he was taking, when he understood that his inability to match another father's military pride had marked him as an outsider in his own daughter's world. From that day forward, our relationship became an elaborate dance of mutual accommodation. He would ask about my work with the careful politeness of someone inquiring about a job they didn't understand. I would share only the safest details, editing out anything that might remind them how far I'd traveled from the girl they'd once known. When I made lieutenant commander at 28, the youngest in my class, I called home with the news. "That's wonderful, honey," Mom said. "Is that good?" When I took command of my first ship at 31, they asked if it was dangerous. When I was promoted to captain and given command of a guided missile cruiser, they wanted to know if that meant I'd finally be able to settle down somewhere. And when I made Admiral at 43, shattering barriers and making history, Dad's response was the same as always. "Well, sweetheart, I just hope you're happy." By then I understood that happy had become code for normal, for the kind of life they could explain to their friends at church, for achievements they could measure in grandchildren and holiday dinners, rather than in lives saved and missions accomplished. The irony was that I was happy, deeply, profoundly happy in ways they couldn't begin to comprehend, but it was a happiness they couldn't share, because they'd never learned to speak the language of my dreams. The final break had come 3 years ago during what should have been a celebration. I'd been selected to command the Pacific Fleet, the first woman ever to hold that position. It was a moment that represented the culmination of everything I'd worked for, a responsibility that would put me in charge of nearly 200 ships and 140,000 sailors. I'd driven home to share the news in person, expecting that perhaps this achievement as undeniable proof of excellence might finally bridge the gap between us. Instead, I'd found myself sitting in the same kitchen where I'd announced my Naval Academy dreams, facing the same careful expressions of concern. "Admiral of the Pacific Fleet," I'd said, unable to keep the pride from my voice. "It's the highest operational command in the Navy." "That sounds like a lot of responsibility," Mom had said carefully. "Are you sure you're ready for something so big?" Dylan, now married with 2 children and working as a local insurance agent, had been more direct. "Sarah, don't you think it's time to slow down? You're 44 years old. When are you going to start thinking about having a real life?" A real life. As if commanding the defense of half the world's oceans was somehow less real than selling insurance policies in a town of 8,000 people. But it was Marcus who delivered the killing blow. "Look, we're proud of you, okay? But this whole thing, it's like you're trying to prove something to the world instead of just being content with who you are. Dad's getting older, Mom needs help around the house, and you're never here. Success is great, but family comes first." That word, prove, had hit me like a physical slap. As if my entire career, every sacrifice I'd made, every barrier I'd broken, was just some elaborate attempt to compensate for being inadequate in the ways that really mattered to them. I'd left that day understanding that we'd reached an unbridgeable divide. They would continue to love me in their limited way, but they would never understand me. And I would continue to achieve things they couldn't comprehend, while carrying the weight of their disappointment like stones in my pockets. Now, standing outside my father's funeral, I realized that all those years of trying to make them proud while staying true to myself had been an impossible task. You can't force people to see greatness when they're looking for something entirely different. The rain was still falling, and my uniform was thoroughly soaked, but I stayed where I was. Inside that church, they were mourning the loss of a man who'd loved me but never quite knew what to do with me. Out here, I was mourning the loss of something else. The dream that love and understanding were the same thing, and that being exceptional might somehow be enough to overcome the fear that I'd become someone they couldn't recognize as family. But as I watched the last of the mourners file out of the church, I felt something shifting inside me. Not acceptance. I wasn't ready for that yet. But clarity. For the first time in years, I knew exactly who I was and what I'd accomplished, regardless of whether they could see it. And maybe, just maybe, that would have to be enough. 6 weeks before Dad's funeral, I received a phone call that changed everything. I was in my office at Pearl Harbor, reviewing deployment schedules for the 7th Fleet, when my personal phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Admiral Hawthorne? The voice was elderly, shaky, with a thick Boston accent. This is Attorney Robert Kellerman from Kellerman Walsh & Associates. I'm calling regarding your father's estate planning. My pen stopped moving across the deployment roster. I'm sorry, what? My father's estate? Yes, ma'am. Your father, Captain James Hawthorne, retired. He listed you as his primary beneficiary, and we need to discuss some urgent matters regarding his will and financial arrangements. Would it be possible to schedule a meeting? The world seemed to tilt slightly. Primary beneficiary? Are you sure you have the right person? I haven't spoken to my father in over a year. There was a pause, and I could hear papers rustling. Admiral, I have your service record here. Your current posting. Everything matches. Your father was very specific about his wishes. In fact, he updated his will just 6 months ago to ensure everything was properly documented. 6 months ago. That would have been right around the time of our last awkward visit, when we'd sat on his porch talking about tomatoes instead of the 20-year gulf between us. 3 days later, I was sitting across from Attorney Kellerman in his cramped office in downtown Millfield Harbor. The building smelled like old books and coffee, and the lawyer's desk was covered with neat stacks of papers that represented a lifetime of careful planning. Your father was a meticulous man, Kellerman said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He came to me shortly after your promotion to Admiral and asked me to completely restructure his estate. Everything. The house, his pension, his savings, his investments. All of it goes to you. I stared at the documents spread before me, my father's careful signature at the bottom of each page. What about my mother? My brothers? Kellerman's expression grew uncomfortable. That's where things get complicated. Your father discovered some financial irregularities about 8 months ago. It appears that your mother and brothers have been systematically withdrawing money from his accounts without his knowledge or permission. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. What do you mean? Joint accounts that were supposed to be for emergencies only. Credit cards opened in his name. Even a second mortgage on the house that he never signed for. Kellerman pulled out a thick folder and opened it. We're talking about approximately $340,000 over the past 5 years. I felt like I'd been hit by a rogue wave. That's not possible. My family would never. But even as I said it, memories started clicking into place. Marcus's new truck last year, the one he claimed he'd gotten a great deal on. Dylan's wife's expensive jewelry that had seemed far beyond their means. The vacation to Europe that Mom had taken with her sisters, the one she'd mentioned casually during our last phone conversation. Your father hired a private investigator, Kellerman continued gently. He wanted to be absolutely certain before taking any action. The evidence is quite comprehensive. He slid a manila envelope across the desk. Inside were photographs, bank statements, credit reports, and what looked like surveillance footage. My hands trembled slightly as I flipped through the documentation. There was Marcus at a luxury car dealership, signing papers. Dylan and his wife at a real estate office, apparently buying a vacation property. Mom at an upscale jewelry store, purchasing what looked like an expensive watch. All of it funded by money that belonged to my father, a man who'd worked double shifts at the shipyard for 30 years and had saved every penny for his retirement. The investigation revealed that they'd been using his dementia medication to justify the financial activities, Kellerman said quietly, telling financial institutions that he was becoming forgetful and needed help managing his affairs. But your father was sharp as a tack. He just pretended to go along with it while documenting everything. I looked up from the photographs, feeling sick. He knew? He knew they were stealing from him? For at least 6 months before he came to me, he was heartbroken, Admiral. He kept saying he couldn't understand how his own family could betray his trust like that. Kellerman leaned forward. But he also said something else. He said he finally understood why you'd kept your distance. He realized that you'd seen something in them that he'd been too blind to see. The words hit me like a depth charge, exploding somewhere deep in my chest. All those years of feeling like the outsider, the one who didn't belong, the daughter who'd chosen duty over family. And it turned out that I'd been the only one who couldn't be bought, manipulated, or used. There's more, Kellerman said carefully. Your father asked me to conduct some additional research into your brother's financial situations. It appears this isn't their first foray into creative financing. He produced another folder, this one containing court documents and credit reports. Marcus had defaulted on 2 previous car loans and had a history of maxed-out credit cards. Dylan had filed for bankruptcy 3 years earlier, something he'd never mentioned to the family. Both of them had outstanding debts that far exceeded their legitimate income. They've been living beyond their means for years, Kellerman explained. Your father's money was just the latest source of funding for lifestyles they couldn't actually afford. I sat back in the leather chair, trying to process what I was learning. My entire life, I'd been made to feel like the selfish one, the daughter who'd chosen career over family, success over love. But while I'd been serving my country and earning my achievements through sacrifice and dedication, they'd been systematically robbing the man who'd raised us. What did my father want to do about this? I asked. Kellerman's expression grew sad. He wanted to confront them, demand the money back, possibly press charges. But then his health started declining rapidly. The cancer diagnosis came just a few weeks after he'd finalized the new will. Cancer. Another piece of information that no one had bothered to share with me. My father had been dying, and I'd found out from a lawyer rather than from my own family. How long did he have? I whispered. The doctors gave him 6 months. That was 4 months ago. Kellerman reached across the desk and touched my hand briefly. Admiral, your father specifically asked me to tell you something. He said he was sorry it took him so long to see who you really were, and who they really were. He said he understood now why you'd built a life so far away from them. I couldn't speak. The words I'd been waiting my entire adult life to hear had come through a lawyer, after it was too late to matter. There's one more thing, Kellerman said gently. Your father left you a letter. He wrote it the day he finalized the will and asked me to give it to you only after he was gone. He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Dad's careful script. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open it. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in his familiar handwriting. Sarah, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you know the truth about what your mother and brothers have been doing. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, and I'm sorrier that it took me so long to see what was right in front of me. You were always the strongest of my children, but I mistook that strength for distance. I thought your achievements meant you didn't need us anymore, when the truth was that we didn't deserve you. You built a life based on honor, duty, and service to others. They built lives based on taking what they could get. Akolatai, I know I failed you as a father. I should have defended your dreams instead of questioning them. I should have celebrated your achievements instead of worrying about your happiness. Most of all, I should have seen that your happiness came from doing meaningful work, not from their approval. The house, the money, everything I have, it all goes to you, because you're the only one who earned it through character rather than manipulation. But more than that, you're the only one who became the person I hoped to raise. Mata Gostrere. I'm proud of you, Admiral. I always was, even when I didn't know how to show it. Your father, James. The letter blurred as tears I'd been holding back for 40 years finally came. All the validation I'd never received, all the pride I'd never seen in his eyes, all the understanding I'd given up hope of finding. It was there, written in his careful script, delivered too late to heal the wounds, but early enough to change everything. I sat in that lawyer's office and cried for the father I'd lost before I'd ever really had him, for the family that had never truly been mine, and for the devastating realization that I'd been fighting for the love of people who saw me only as an asset to be managed, or an obstacle to be overcome. When I finally composed myself, Kellerman was waiting patiently, a box of tissues within easy reach. "What happens now?" I asked. "Well, the will is ironclad. Your father was very thorough, but—" He hesitated. "Admiral, they don't know about any of this yet. As far as your family knows, your father died with his original will intact, the one that left everything to your mother, with provisions for your brothers." I looked at him sharply. "They don't know he changed it?" "No, ma'am, and they don't know about the investigation into their financial activities. Your father specifically requested that the new will only be revealed after the funeral." "Why?" Kellerman smiled grimly. "He said he wanted to see how they'd behave when they thought they'd gotten away with everything. He called it his final test of their character." I understood then why I'd been banned from the funeral. They couldn't risk having me there when they were planning to inherit everything they'd already spent. My presence would have been a complication, a potential claimant who might ask uncomfortable questions about Dad's estate. They'd stolen from him while he was alive, and now they were planning to profit from his death while excluding the one person he'd actually wanted to inherit his legacy. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed that Dad was as blind to their true nature as he'd always seemed. They'd counted on his love, making him willfully ignorant of their betrayal. Instead, his love had opened his eyes, and his final act of parenting had been to ensure that justice would be served, even if he wouldn't be alive to see it. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into my uniform jacket, right over my heart. In 6 days, they would gather for the reading of the will, expecting to divide up the spoils of their deception. Instead, they were going to discover that the man they'd underestimated had seen through them completely, and the daughter they'd rejected had inherited not just his estate, but his final act of faith in her character. For the first time in years, I smiled. Not with happiness. The pain was still too fresh for that, but with something else, something harder and more lasting. I smiled with the satisfaction of knowing that the truth, no matter how long delayed, always finds a way to surface. And sometimes, it brings the Navy with it. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 2 p.m., exactly 1 week after the funeral I'd been banned from attending. I spent those 7 days in a strange state of suspended animation, staying at a small bed and breakfast on the outskirts of Millfield Harbor, watching the town where I'd grown up go about its daily business, while carrying the weight of secrets that would soon explode like depth charges. I used the time to prepare, not just emotionally but strategically. 29 years in the Navy had taught me that information was power, and I wanted to understand exactly what I was walking into. I called Attorney Kellerman and asked him to compile every piece of evidence Dad had gathered, every financial record, every photograph from the private investigator. If my family wanted a fight, I would come armed with facts. I also made some calls to old contacts at the Pentagon, asking discreet questions about asset recovery and financial fraud. Not because I planned to pursue criminal charges, at least not yet, but because I wanted to understand all my options. The conversations were illuminating. According to a JAG officer I'd worked with during my time at Norfolk, what my family had done constituted elder financial abuse, a federal crime that carried serious penalties. With that level of systematic theft and the documentation you're describing, Commander Patricia Mills had told me over the phone, you're looking at potential felony charges. The fact that they used his medical condition as justification makes it even worse. But criminal charges weren't what I wanted. What I wanted was something much more valuable. The truth, spoken aloud in front of witnesses, with no possibility of denial or deflection. On Tuesday morning, I put on my dress blue uniform for the second time that week. Every ribbon was perfectly aligned, every button polished to a mirror shine. I wasn't dressing for a legal proceeding. I was suiting up for battle. The woman who walked into Kellerman's office that afternoon wasn't the daughter they'd dismissed or the sister they'd underestimated. She was Admiral Sarah Elizabeth Hawthorne, and she was done pretending to be anything less. The waiting room was exactly as I'd expected. Mom sat in the center chair, wearing her best black dress and the pearls that had probably cost more than Dad's monthly pension check. Marcus flanked her right side in a suit that looked expensive but ill-fitting, his tie slightly crooked despite obvious attempts to look respectful. Dylan sat to her left, fidgeting with his phone and checking his watch every few minutes like he had somewhere more important to be. They all looked up when I entered, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sarah. Mom's voice was carefully neutral, the tone she used when she was trying to maintain civility while being deeply annoyed. "What are you doing here?" "I was invited," I said simply, taking the seat directly across from them. "Attorney Kellerman asked me to attend." Marcus leaned forward, his expression suspicious. "Invited for what?" "This is just a formality. Dad's will was pretty straightforward." I smiled without warmth. "Was it?" Before anyone could respond, Kellerman's secretary appeared to escort us into the conference room. The space was formal and intimidating, with dark wood paneling and leather chairs arranged around a mahogany table that probably cost more than most people's cars. Kellerman sat at the head of the table, flanked by 2 associates I hadn't met before. "Thank you all for coming," Kellerman began, his voice professionally neutral. "As you know, we're here for the reading of Captain James Hawthorne's last will and testament. Before we begin, I want to note that this meeting is being recorded, as per standard practice for estate proceedings." Dylan shifted uncomfortably. "Recorded? Is that really necessary?" "It's for everyone's protection," one of the associates replied smoothly. "It ensures there are no questions about what was said or decided." Kellerman opened a thick folder and pulled out 2 documents. Captain Hawthorne actually had 2 wills. The first was created in 2018 and remained in effect until 6 months ago. The second was created in February of this year and supersedes all previous versions. I watched my family's faces carefully, Marcus's brow furrowed in confusion. Dylan stopped fidgeting. Mom's grip on her purse tightened almost imperceptibly. "I think there's been some mistake," Mom said carefully. "James never mentioned changing his will. Are you sure this second document is legitimate?" "Completely sure, Mrs. Hawthorne. Your husband came to this office multiple times over a period of several weeks. He was very thorough, very deliberate, and I can assure you he was of completely sound mind." Kellerman adjusted his glasses and began reading from the newer document. "I, James Michael Hawthorne, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and declare this to be my last will and testament." The formal language filled the room like fog, creating a buffer between the explosive content and the people who were about to be destroyed by it. But I wasn't listening to the legal terminology. I was watching my family's faces as they slowly realized that something had gone very wrong with their plans. To my beloved daughter, Admiral Sarah Elizabeth Hawthorne, who has lived her life with honor, integrity, and service to others, I leave my entire estate, including but not limited to my residence at 847 Maple Street, all financial accounts, investments, personal property, and any other assets in my name at the time of my death. The silence that followed was absolute. Dylan's mouth actually fell open. Marcus went completely still, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and the first stirrings of anger. But it was Mom's reaction that cut the deepest. She didn't look shocked or hurt. She looked calculating, like she was already trying to figure out how to contest what she'd just heard. "That can't be right," Marcus said finally. "Dad would never. Sarah hasn't even been part of this family for years. She didn't even come to the funeral." "Actually," I said quietly, "I was there. I stood outside in the rain while you all mourned inside, because you made it very clear that I wasn't welcome." "You made yourself unwelcome," Dylan shot back. "Always acting like you're better than us, like your military career is more important than family." "Is it?" I asked. "More important than family? What's that supposed to mean?" I looked at Kellerman, who nodded almost imperceptibly. This was the moment Dad had planned for, the final test he'd designed to reveal their true character, and they were failing it spectacularly. "It means," I said calmly, "that while I was serving my country and sending letters home that were never answered, calling on holidays and getting voicemail, trying to maintain relationships with people who clearly didn't want me around, while I was doing all of that, you were stealing from the man who raised us." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Marcus went pale. Dylan's hands started trembling. Mom's carefully composed expression finally cracked. That's a terrible thing to say," she whispered. "How dare you accuse us of $340,000, I interrupted. Over 5 years. Joint accounts that were supposed to be for emergencies. Credit cards opened without his knowledge. A second mortgage he never signed for. I pulled out the folder Kellerman had given me and placed it on the table. Would you like to see the evidence? The photographs scattered across the mahogany surface like evidence at a crime scene. Marcus at the car dealership. Dylan and his wife house hunting. Mom is buying expensive jewelry. All of it documented, time-stamped, undeniable. Dad hired a private investigator, I continued, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. He knew what you were doing. He knew you were using his supposed dementia as an excuse to drain his accounts. And he documented every single theft. It wasn't theft, Marcus said desperately. We were helping him manage his finances. He was getting forgetful. He was sharp as a tack, Kellerman interrupted. I met with Captain Hawthorne multiple times over several months. He was completely lucid, completely aware of what was happening to his money, and completely disgusted by his family's betrayal. Dylan slammed his hand on the table. This is insane. You can't possibly believe that we would steal from our own father. I don't have to believe it, I said, pulling out my phone. I can prove it. I scrolled to the voice memo I'd recorded the day before and pressed play. Dad's voice filled the room, tinny but unmistakable, speaking to the private investigator. I just can't understand how they could do this to me. 30 years I worked double shifts to save for retirement, and they're treating my accounts like their personal piggy bank. The worst part is watching them pretend to care about my health while they're using it as an excuse to rob me blind. Mom's face went white. Where did you get that? Dad recorded multiple conversations with the investigator. Hours of audio documenting his feelings about what you were doing to him. I looked around the table at their shocked faces. Did you really think he was too senile to notice? Or did you just not care? Sarah, please, Mom said, her voice breaking. We can explain. Can you? I stood up, placing my hands flat on the table and leaning forward. Can you explain why you stole from a dying man? Can you explain why you used his love for you as a weapon against him? Can you explain why you banned me from his funeral because you were afraid I might interfere with your plans to inherit money you'd already stolen? The words came out like bullets, each one finding its target. Marcus looked sick. Dylan was staring at his hands. Mom was crying, but they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of someone who'd been caught. We never meant for it to go this far, she whispered. We needed help, and the money was just sitting there, and we thought... You thought what? That he wouldn't notice? That he wouldn't care? Or did you think that because I wasn't around to protect him, you could do whatever you wanted? The truth was written on their faces. They'd counted on Dad's love making him vulnerable, on my absence making him isolated, on their ability to manipulate a situation to their advantage. They'd turned family dynamics into a criminal enterprise. The irony, I said, straightening up and adjusting my uniform jacket, is that you spent years telling me I wasn't really part of this family. You made me feel like an outsider, like someone who'd chosen duty over love. But it turns out that I was the only one who actually loved him enough not to rob him. I picked up the photographs and slid them back into the folder. Dad left me everything not because I was his favorite, but because I was the only one who proved I could be trusted with it. While you were stealing from him, I was earning his respect. While you were lying to him, I was living with honor. What happens now? Dylan asked, his voice barely audible. I looked at Kellerman, who cleared his throat. Well, the will is valid and binding. Admiral Hawthorne is the sole beneficiary of the estate. However, there's also the matter of the funds that were improperly withdrawn from Captain Hawthorne's accounts. You want us to pay it back? Marcus said flatly. I want you to understand, I said, that what you did was a federal crime. Elder financial abuse, fraud, identity theft. I could have you prosecuted and sent to prison. The room fell silent except for the sound of Mom's quiet sobbing. But I'm not going to do that, I continued. Do you know why? They looked up at me with desperate hope. Because Dad wouldn't have wanted me to destroy his family, even after what you did to him. And because I'm not like you. I don't use love as a weapon. I moved toward the door, then turned back one final time. You have 30 days to return every cent you stole, every dollar, with interest. If you do that, we never speak of this again. If you don't... I let the threat hang in the air. Well, then we'll see how much family loyalty really means when it's tested in federal court. As I reached for the door handle, Marcus called out desperately, "Sarah, wait! We're still family. This doesn't have to destroy everything." I paused without turning around. "You destroyed everything the moment you decided that Dad's love was something you could exploit rather than earn." I just finally stopped pretending otherwise. The door closed behind me with a soft click, leaving them alone with the wreckage of their lies and the echo of consequences they'd never seen coming. For the first time in my adult life, I walked away from my family without feeling like I was the one who'd failed them. This time, I knew exactly who had failed whom. 2 days after the will reading, I was standing in my father's kitchen, boxing up his belongings, when I heard the sound that would change everything. It started as a low rumble in the distance, growing steadily louder until the windows began to vibrate. I stepped out onto the back porch and looked up to see 4 military helicopters approaching in perfect formation. The lead aircraft was a VH-60 Whitehawk, its distinctive presidential markings gleaming in the afternoon sun. Behind it flew 3 CH-53E Super Stallions, their massive rotors churning the air into a controlled hurricane. The entire neighborhood had come out to watch as the helicopters circled once before landing in the large field behind Dad's house. The same field where he used to teach me to throw a baseball when I was 8 years old. My phone buzzed with a call from Admiral Patricia Chen, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the highest-ranking officer in the U.S. military. We'd served together years ago when she was a captain and I was a lieutenant commander, and she'd become both a mentor and friend during my rise through the ranks. "Sarah." Her voice came through clearly despite the rotor noise. "I hope you don't mind the dramatic entrance, but when we heard what happened at your father's funeral, the entire Joint Chiefs agreed that something needed to be done." I watched in amazement as Marines in full-dress uniform began emerging from the helicopters, followed by Navy officers I recognized from my Pentagon days. "Patricia, what's going on?" "Your father's funeral was a disgrace," she said firmly. "A decorated admiral being banned from saying goodbye to a fellow veteran? We couldn't let that stand. So we're giving Captain James Hawthorne the send-off he deserved, and you the respect you've earned." The formation that assembled in that field was unlike anything Millfield Harbor had ever seen. 12 Marines in dress blues formed the honor guard, their white gloves pristine, their postures perfect. Behind them stood officers representing every branch of the military: Navy, Army, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, and Space Force. At the center of it all was Admiral Chen herself, her 4 stars catching the sunlight as she approached the house. By now, half the town had gathered along the street, drawn by the helicopter noise and the unprecedented sight of a full military honor ceremony in their quiet neighborhood. I spotted neighbors I'd known since childhood, standing with their mouths open as they tried to process what they were witnessing. And there, at the edge of the crowd, I saw my family. Mom stood between Marcus and Dylan, all 3 of them looking shell-shocked. They'd probably been watching the news coverage, because yes, this was being covered by local and national media, and realizing that the daughter they'd rejected wasn't just some military officer they could dismiss. She was someone the highest levels of government considered worth honoring. Admiral Chen reached the porch and rendered a crisp salute. "Admiral Hawthorne," she said in a voice that carried across the field. "On behalf of the United States military and a grateful nation, we're here to honor both your father's service and your own." I returned the salute, my throat tight with emotion I couldn't quite name. Behind her, the honor guard had assembled in perfect formation, their rifles at present arms, their faces solemn with the gravity of the moment. "Your father served with distinction in Vietnam," Admiral Chen continued, her voice projecting clearly. "But more than that, he raised a daughter who has served this nation with unprecedented excellence. The woman standing before us has commanded more ships and sailors than any woman in American history. She has been the tip of the spear in 3 major conflicts, saved countless lives through her leadership, and broken barriers that will inspire generations of young women to follow in her footsteps." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. I could see people holding up phones, recording this moment, probably streaming it live to social media. This wasn't just a private ceremony. It was a public statement about what real honor looked like. "Admiral Hawthorne represents the very best of American military tradition," Chen continued. "She has commanded respect through competence, loyalty through leadership, and admiration through her unwavering commitment to duty, honor, and country. Any family would be proud to call her their own. The emphasis on that last sentence was subtle, but unmistakable. I glanced toward where my family stood and saw Mom's face crumple. She understood the implication that while they had rejected me, the entire United States military was claiming me as family. "Today, we correct an injustice," Admiral Chen announced. "Today, we ensure that Captain James Hawthorne receives the military honors he earned, and that his daughter receives the recognition she deserves." What followed was the most moving ceremony I'd ever witnessed. The Marine Honor Guard performed a 21-gun salute that echoed across the harbor like thunder. A Navy bugler played taps with such haunting beauty that half the crowd was crying by the final note. Two Marines folded an American flag with precision that spoke of thousands of hours of practice, then presented it to me with words I'd never expected to hear. "On behalf of the President of the United States Navy, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your father's honorable and faithful service, and as recognition of your own extraordinary contributions to our nation's defense." But the moment that truly changed everything came when Admiral Chen stepped forward one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the crowd, "I want to share something that most of you probably don't know. 3 months ago, Admiral Hawthorne was offered the position of Chief of Naval Operations, the highest position in the United States Navy. She would have been the first woman ever to hold that post." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even I was shocked. That information was supposed to be classified until the official announcement. "She turned it down," Chen continued, "because she felt her skills were better utilized in operational command, leading from the front rather than managing from Washington." That decision saved American lives during the crisis in the Taiwan Strait 2 months ago, when her fleet's rapid response prevented what could have become a regional war. I saw Marcus stumble slightly, reaching out to steady himself against a fence post. Dylan's face had gone completely white. Mom was staring at me like she was seeing me for the first time. "The woman you see before you," Admiral Chen said, turning to face the crowd directly, "could be running the entire United States Navy right now. Instead, she chose to stay where she could best serve her sailors and her country. That is the measure of true leadership, and that is why we are here today, to honor not just her father's memory, but her own extraordinary character." The ceremony concluded with something I'd never seen before: a spontaneous salute from every person in uniform, followed by applause from the civilian crowd that lasted nearly 5 minutes. People were crying, cheering, taking pictures, and sharing the videos in real time. Within hours, hashtags like #Admiral Hawthorne and #TrueHonor were trending on social media platforms. But the most powerful moment came after the official ceremony ended. As the crowd began to disperse, and the Marines were preparing to reboard their helicopters, a small group approached me. They were older men, all wearing Vietnam veteran caps, led by someone I recognized as Mr. Peterson from the hardware store. "Admiral," Mr. Peterson said, removing his cap respectfully, "we knew your father. We served with him in the 173rd Airborne. We just wanted you to know, he talked about you all the time. He was so proud of what you'd accomplished. He kept newspaper clippings about your promotions in his wallet and showed them to everyone." The other veterans nodded in agreement. "He said you were living the life he'd always dreamed of," another added. "Said you were proof that America still produced heroes." One of them, a man with weathered hands and kind eyes, stepped forward. "We also want you to know that we saw what happened at the funeral. How they kept you out. It was wrong, and we're ashamed that we didn't speak up then. Your father would have been ashamed too," Mr. Peterson added firmly. "James Hawthorne loved his family, but he loved justice more. And what happened to you wasn't just." As these men, my father's brothers in arms, spoke about his pride in me, I felt a healing begin that I hadn't expected. The validation I'd been seeking my entire life hadn't come from the family that raised me. It had come from the family I'd earned through service, sacrifice, and honor. The media attention following the ceremony was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Within 24 hours, videos of Admiral Chen's speech had been viewed millions of times. News outlets were calling it the most powerful military tribute in decades, and a masterclass in honoring true service. Editorial writers used it as an example of how the military takes care of its own, even when their biological families fail them. But the coverage also revealed something I hadn't anticipated. I wasn't the only one with this story. Comment sections filled with similar tales. Children who'd chosen military service only to be rejected by families who couldn't understand their sacrifice. Parents who'd been disappointed when their children chose duty over conventional success. Siblings who'd grown apart when one answered the call to serve. A retired Army colonel named Maria Santos wrote a piece for the Washington Post that went viral. Admiral Hawthorne's story isn't unique. It's universal among those of us who've chosen service. The military doesn't just train us to defend our country. It teaches us that sometimes your real family is the one that forms around shared values rather than shared blood. The response from my actual family was swift and predictable. Marcus left several voicemails that progressed from conciliatory to angry to desperate. Dylan sent a series of text messages that swung between apologetic and accusatory. But it was Mom's response that cut the deepest. She appeared on the local news the evening after the ceremony, standing in front of the house I'd grown up in, looking small and frail in a way I'd never seen before. The reporter asked her about the military tribute and what it meant to have such a distinguished daughter. "Sarah has always been ambitious," she said carefully, choosing her words like stepping stones across dangerous water. "We're proud of her accomplishments, of course, but family is about more than achievements. It's about being there for each other, about putting relationships before recognition." The implication was clear. I had chosen recognition over relationships, accomplishments over family loyalty. Even now, even after everything that had been revealed, she was painting herself as the victim of my selfish pursuit of success. But then the reporter asked the question that changed everything. "Mrs. Hawthorne, some people are saying your daughter was banned from her father's funeral. Is that true?" The pause that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. I watched Mom's face cycle through emotions: surprise, calculation, resignation, and finally, something that might have been shame. "There were family disagreements," she said finally. "Sometimes these things are more complicated than they appear from the outside." It was a non-answer, but the reporter pressed further. "The Admiral mentioned that she stood outside in the rain during the service. Don't you think a war hero deserves better treatment from her own family?" "I think," Mom said, her voice tight with suppressed anger, "that war heroes are made by the media, but families are broken by the people in them. Sarah made her choices. We made ours." The interview ended there, but the damage was done. Social media lit up with criticism of my family's treatment of me. #We'reHeroInTheRain became another trending hashtag. Editorial writers condemned parents who couldn't celebrate their children's extraordinary achievements. Support groups for military families shared the story as an example of how not to treat a service member. Within a week, my mother was being portrayed as the villain in a national conversation about family, duty, and the price of service. Marcus and Dylan were receiving angry messages from strangers. Their employers were getting calls questioning whether people with such poor character should be trusted with other people's money and insurance. Part of me felt vindicated. For the first time in my life, the court of public opinion was on my side. But mostly, I felt exhausted. The validation I'd craved for so long had come at the cost of any possibility of reconciliation with my family. We'd moved beyond private disagreements into public condemnation, and there was no way back from that. 3 weeks after the ceremony, I was in my temporary office at the Norfolk Naval Base, trying to process transfer requests and deployment schedules while ignoring the constant stream of interview requests. When my aide knocked on the door. "Admiral, there's someone here to see you. She says she's your mother." I looked up from the reports I'd been pretending to read. "Send her in." Mom entered my office like she was walking into enemy territory, cautious, defensive, ready for attack. She looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow, as if the weight of public judgment had compressed her into a more fragile version of herself. She sat in the chair across from my desk without being invited, her purse clutched in her lap like armor. "Sarah," she said simply. "Mom." We stared at each other across the mahogany desk, two women who'd once shared a home but now felt like strangers from different worlds. She looked around the office, taking in the flags, the photographs with world leaders, the awards and commendations that covered one entire wall. "This is impressive," she said finally. "Thank you. I never really understood what you did, what all of this meant." She gestured vaguely at the symbols of my career surrounding us. "I know." She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on a photograph behind my desk. Me shaking hands with the president after the Taiwan Strait crisis. Both of us smiling in the sunshine on the White House lawn. "Your father kept pictures," she said suddenly. "In his desk drawer. Pictures from newspapers, articles about your promotions, printouts from the Navy website. I found them when we were cleaning out his things." I waited, not trusting myself to speak. There were dozens of them, going back years. He would read them over and over, especially when he was sick. Her voice broke slightly. "I asked him once why he never told you how proud he was. Why he never shared those articles with us. What did he say? He said he was afraid that if he showed how proud he was of your success, we'd feel like failures by comparison. He said he was trying to protect our feelings by hiding his pride in you." She looked directly at me for the first time since entering the office. He was wrong. We were already failures. We just didn't know it yet. The admission hung between us like smoke from a distant fire. Not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement of truth that had been buried under years of denial and rationalization. "The money," she continued, "we'll pay it back. All of it. Marcus took out a loan against his house. Dylan is selling his vacation property. It might take time, but you'll get every penny." "I don't care about the money," I said quietly. "I know. That's what makes this worse." She stood up slowly, like movement caused her pain. "I came here to tell you that I'm sorry. Not for the cameras, not for the reporters, just for you. I'm sorry we never saw who you really were. I'm sorry we made you feel like you had to choose between us and your dreams. Most of all, I'm sorry that it took a public humiliation for me to understand what we lost when we pushed you away." She moved toward the door, then paused. "The ceremony was beautiful. Your father would have loved it. He would have been so proud to see all those people honoring you." "Mom," I called as she reached for the door handle. She turned back. "I'm sorry too. Sorry that my success felt like judgment of your choices. Sorry that I couldn't find a way to be both the daughter you wanted and the woman I needed to become." "You shouldn't have to apologize for being extraordinary," she said softly. "That's our failure, not yours." After she left, I sat alone in my office for a long time, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across my desk. The conversation hadn't fixed anything. The damage was too deep for that. But it had given me something I hadn't expected: clarity. For years I'd carried the weight of their disappointment, always wondering if I'd made the wrong choices, if success was worth the cost of family alienation. Now I understood that there had never been a choice to make. I couldn't have been anyone other than who I was, and they couldn't have accepted anyone other than who they wanted me to be. The tragedy wasn't that we'd grown apart. The tragedy was that we'd never really been together in the first place. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of the USS Columbia, watching the sun rise over the Pacific Ocean. The ship was heading home after a 6-month deployment, and the crew was excited about reuniting with their families. I watched young sailors checking their phones for messages from spouses and children, saw petty officers making plans for shore leave, listened to the constant chatter about who would be waiting at the pier when we docked. For the first time in my career, I wasn't envious of their family connections. I'd found something better than the acceptance I'd always craved. I'd found peace with who I was and what I'd chosen. The ceremony in Millfield Harbor had marked more than just my father's belated honor. It had marked the end of my long campaign for approval from people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. Not because they were evil, but because they were small. Their world was small, their dreams were small, and their capacity to understand greatness was small. I'd spent 47 years trying to shrink myself to fit their world instead of accepting that I belonged in a larger one. The phone calls from home had stopped after Mom's visit to Norfolk. The angry voicemails, the guilt-tripping texts, the passive-aggressive attempts to make me responsible for their hurt feelings. All of it had finally ended. Not because they'd found peace with our estrangement, but because they'd finally understood that I had. I still sent Christmas cards. I still remembered birthdays with brief, polite messages. But I'd stopped hoping for anything in return, and paradoxically, That made me happier than I'd been in years. The real transformation had come when I started using my story to help others. The media attention had brought me into contact with dozens of military families struggling with similar dynamics. Parents who couldn't understand why their children chose service over civilian careers. Children who felt like they had to choose between family approval and personal fulfillment. Spouses who felt abandoned when their partners deployed or took difficult assignments. I began speaking at military family readiness groups, sharing my experience and offering perspective from someone who'd walked the hardest path and survived. The message was always the same. Love shouldn't require you to be less than you are, and real family supports your growth, rather than demanding your diminishment. One conversation stood out from all the others. A young Navy lieutenant named Jennifer Walsh approached me after a speech at the Naval War College. She was crying, clutching a letter from her parents that essentially disowned her for choosing a military career over the teaching job they'd wanted her to take. "How do you do it?" she asked through her tears. "How do you keep going when the people who are supposed to love you most think you've made a terrible mistake?" I handed her a tissue and sat down beside her on the steps of the auditorium. You do it by understanding that their inability to see your worth doesn't diminish it. You do it by finding your tribe, the people who share your values and understand your choices. And you do it by refusing to make yourself smaller just to make them more comfortable. But they're my parents. Shouldn't their opinion matter more than anyone else's? Their opinion should matter, I said carefully. But it shouldn't control your life. The hardest lesson I ever learned was that you can't earn love by achieving things, and you can't lose love by being yourself. If their love has conditions attached to it, then it's not really love. It's manipulation disguised as affection. She looked up at me with the same desperate hope I'd seen in my own eyes for too many years. Do you think they'll ever understand? Maybe. Maybe not. But here's what I know for certain. You can't live your life waiting for other people's understanding. You have to understand yourself, respect yourself, and build a life that makes sense to you. If they eventually come around, that's a bonus. If they don't, you'll still have built something meaningful. That conversation, repeated dozens of times with different people, helped me understand something crucial. My story wasn't unique. Military service attracts people who are willing to sacrifice personal comfort for larger purposes, and that often puts us at odds with family members who prioritize security and conventional success over service and honor. The uniform I wore wasn't just a symbol of my profession. It was a symbol of my willingness to put duty before personal desires, country before family, honor before ease. Those choices had cost me the approval of the people who shared my blood, but they'd earned me the respect of people who shared my values. And in the end, that trade had been worth making. Ply Sebelhusher. Yelnan Piquapia Sebelhusher Tai. I began using my position and resources to create something lasting. The Hawthorne Foundation for Military Families provided counseling and support for service members dealing with family rejection or misunderstanding. We offered workshops for parents trying to understand their military children, support groups for spouses and children of deployed service members, and scholarships for young people whose families couldn't or wouldn't support their desire to serve. The Foundation's first major project was a documentary called The Space Between: Military Service and Family Love. It featured interviews with dozens of military families, exploring the challenges of maintaining relationships when one member chooses a path the others can't understand. My own story was part of it, but so were stories of reconciliation, understanding, and families who'd learned to bridge the gap between civilian and military worlds. The documentary premiered at the Pentagon, with an audience that included the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and hundreds of military families. But the moment that meant the most to me came during the Q&A session afterward, when a young Marine's mother stood up to speak. "I want to thank Admiral Hawthorne for helping me understand my son," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I spent 3 years being angry that he chose the Marines over college, feeling like he was throwing his life away. But watching this film, hearing these stories, I finally understand that he wasn't rejecting our family. He was answering a call that we couldn't hear. I'm proud of him now in ways I never knew how to be before." That was the moment I knew my father's death, my family's rejection, and all the pain that had brought me to this point had served a purpose larger than my own healing. Sometimes our greatest wounds become our greatest strengths, and our deepest hurts become our most powerful tools for helping others. On my 50th birthday, I received an unexpected package. Inside was a wooden box, old and worn, with a note attached. "Sarah, Dad wanted you to have this. He kept it in this closet, never told any of us about it. We found it when we were finally cleaning out his room. Every ho, Sal, I hope someday you can forgive us. Amicus." Inside the box were all the newspaper clippings my mother had mentioned, along with letters I'd written home during my early deployments that I thought had never been read. Each article was carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. Every letter had been read so many times the creases were wearing through. At the bottom of the box was a single photograph. Me at 8 years old, standing on his back porch in his oversized military boots, saluting the camera with a gap-toothed grin. On the back, in his handwriting, were the words, "My little Admiral. I always knew she'd be something special." I held that photograph for a long time, remembering the girl who'd dreamed of flying jets and commanding ships, who'd believed her father when he told her she could do anything. It had taken 42 years and a public vindication for me to understand that he'd been right all along. He had known I was special. He just hadn't known how to reconcile his pride in my achievements with his family's inability to understand them. The box sits on my desk now, a reminder that love and understanding aren't always the same thing, but that both can exist across time and distance, and even death. My father loved me enough to save every record of my success, even when he couldn't share that pride with the family that raised me. In the end, maybe that was enough. Today, I command the largest fleet in the world's most powerful navy. I make decisions that affect global security and American interests. I've been offered positions that would make me one of the most powerful people in Washington. But the achievement I'm most proud of is much simpler. I learned to value myself the way I deserve to be valued, regardless of whether anyone else could see that worth. To anyone listening who feels caught between duty and family, between personal calling and other people's expectations, between being who you are and who others want you to be, I want you to know that you don't have to choose. You can honor your family while honoring yourself. You can love people who don't understand you. You can grieve the relationships you lost while celebrating the person you became. Your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to see it. Your success isn't diminished by other people's failure to celebrate it. And your happiness doesn't require other people's approval. The uniform I wear represents more than military service. It represents the courage to be who you're meant to be, even when that choice costs you the comfort of being who others want you to be. Not everyone will understand that choice, but for those who do, for those who share your values and support your growth, you'll find that they become your real family. And sometimes, that family is bigger, stronger, and more lasting than the one you were born into. That's not a tragedy, that's a triumph. Welcome back, Admiral. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.